Encouraging greener ways to travel, be that by foot, bike, public transport, or electric vehicle, is vital to reduce our carbon footprint. Some of our projects include establishing a community car share scheme, offering electric vehicles for hire on the Isles of Scilly, investment into an enhanced rail facility near Penzance, to support increased services on the main line and intercity express trains. A multimodal hub at St. Erth to encourage people out of their cars by linking rail, road and bus together in one place. And enhancing multi-use trails, enabling people to make everyday journeys and leisure trips on foot or by cycle. And there's more happening locally.
Our CIL project is to connect Porthleven to the Penrose estate with a green link that ultimately provides a full connection between Helston and Porthleven. If we can bring green links into the town so that people don't have to get in their cars and go to out-of-town shops or other towns, and if we can do that in terms of public transport as well, then we will start to make a dent in the carbon emissions of Helston.
And there's also going to be planting of hedges, which we are hoping to get local school children involved in, which is wonderful for them to participate in, planting trees. That's good for our health, it reduces emissions, air quality is better, everyone's a winner.
We've got to think holistically about the transport solution for a town and for the rural areas of Cornwall.
So people come to Cornwall because the air quality is superb here. But there are some places in Cornwall where the congestion is a little bit higher, some of the towns. Yeah, so we're carrying out various trials in Cornwall where we're restricting traffic, particularly motorised vehicles in towns. So I'm helping to do that by encouraging, for example, the use of electric bikes, helping people to get to work who have transport issues or college or training. We're also holding road shows so that we can give people an opportunity to try bikes, see what they're like. Cars are the biggest contributor towards emissions. By walking and using electric bikes, we are emitting no emissions at all. We're improving the environment, we're improving congestion, and as a result, we're improving the air quality. We're leaving a better future for not just the children, but for everyone.
Well, you're seeing all the time with the climate emergency, you're seeing all sorts of things changing. Like we've seen tuna for the first time ever in my lifetime. The whole changes to the atmosphere, and we've had really weird weather all year. We had storms in August, we've had the best ever October on record. So for about 5 years now, we've had our boating app, which enables residents of Snagness and other people on the islands to share our boat trips, reducing the cost, therefore reducing their carbon footprint. We've very recently installed solar panels on the boat, which enables us to run all our electrical systems without having to charge the batteries, running the engines to charge the batteries up. We've very recently joined a scheme where we offset our carbon footprint. So we calculated how much fuel we consume over the year and what the costs of that were, and also the other carbon we produce. And we then contacted a company called Carbon Neutral Britain, and they enabled us to completely carbon offset our business, so we're completely carbon neutral.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the transport session of today's event. I'm your host for this session. I'm Councillor Steve Watt, lead member for the Environment and Climate Change for the Council of the Isles of Scilly. And over the next 50 minutes or so, we'll be listening to Beate Kubitz, who is a bit of a polymath in my mind anyway, as a consultant in innovative transport, use case builder, social media and search engine expert, transport writer, sheep farmer, artist, illustrator, and even a mountain biker. So how about that? And we will also hear from a local advocate on how we move around, Dr. Tim Fox, who represents Bannerman. It's an organisation in Cornwall that is dedicated to delivering a local clean energy revolution. So enough of that. So let's move on. So over to you, Beate Kubitz.
Hello everyone, my name is Beate Kubitz and I'm here to talk about transport and decarbonisation. I'm a specialist in future mobility, new forms of transport like shared transport and decarbonisation. I'm a fellow of the Foundation for Integrated Transport and an associate lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire on future mobility. So this is the scale of the problem. Transport emits carbon. We emit 122 million tonnes of CO2 emission equivalent every year. And that's 27% of the UK's total emissions. It's quite a big percentage. And the scale of emissions, well, this is where we have a problem. We've been reducing carbon emissions in the UK over the last few years. However, transport has kind of held steady, and road transport, which is the biggest element of our transport carbon emissions, has been increasing. So we've got a problem where about 20% of our carbon emissions are generated by road transport. So it's a high proportion of our total carbon emissions, and that's a huge problem for us. We also have a problem with aviation emissions, which aren't even counted in that 20% and are over 33 million tonnes of carbon emissions per year. So emissions are going up. What can we do about them? Well, the first thing we can do is reduce demand. That means switching away from road transport in lots of different ways, whether it's from sharing vehicles or moving how we make our journeys. And then we need to switch to renewably powered propulsion, which can mean a whole variety of different types of propulsion. So hydrogen power, electric vehicles, and obviously there are a whole panoply of other biofuels which are coming on stream. So these are some examples of what we personally can do to reduce our carbon transport budgets. We can work from home. That's me during lockdown working from home. And obviously not everyone can do that. But if you can work from home, even if you only work from home 1 day a week, that can cut your carbon footprint by 20%. So you can make quite a big impact just by working from home 1 or 2 days a week. You can also move away from road transport, either to shared road transport like buses, which are much more carbon efficient than cars, or trains, which are a tiny fraction of the UK's carbon budget for transport. Or you can use sustainable transport, active travel. Like here we've got this cargo bike. My lockdown project, which I was working on in that working from home picture, was to set up a cargo bike delivery service and try out cargo bikes in quite a rural situation, as you can see in West Yorkshire. Then the other thing we can do is share resources better. On the left, we've got a photo here of how people in Germany use car share. This is in Erfurt, nice sunny photo. And one of the things we have to remember is that making cars is part of our carbon budget. It increases our carbon footprint to have more cars on the road, because cars can be between 6 and 35 tonnes of emitted carbon dioxide just in their manufacture. So if we can utilise resources more highly, more people use more cars, then we reduce the amount of carbon per use, which is great. And also you can save money, particularly if you have a little used second car. You can quite often find that it's much cheaper to use a car club for those essential but less frequent journeys by car. Bike share is another of the innovative transport modes that's come to the fore over the last 10 years, enabling people to make that last bit of their journey. Perhaps they've arrived at a rail station and then they want to travel further to their destination by bike rather than getting a taxi or driving to their destination. So we've got an example in Germany, in Leipzig, very nice street, or Bristol, where we've got the Brompton Dock, where we have bike share in lots of different locations and types of locations. Then we can look at the vehicles we use. Van delivery is one of our higher emitting parts of our carbon dioxide budget. It's also increasing, particularly with lockdown and the increase of online purchases. So we can change the vehicles we can use. as I've told you, I'm a big fan of cargo bikes, and here we've got Fran on Lottie the cargo bike delivering in West Yorkshire. But we're not just crazy in West Yorkshire. Here in the middle and on the right, we have the French Postal Service, which uses cargo bikes to deliver in urban and semi-urban areas. So you've got cargo bikes and you've got these little dinky electrically propelled vehicles, which much better fit the streets and the air quality conditions, and also fit the quantities of things that are being shipped to the size of the vehicle. Because quite often the white vans that we see are half empty. So yes, so changing our business models and changing the types of vehicles we use is quite an important part of carbon reduction. And obviously electrifying or using other forms of fuel is an essential part. So moving, if you really want a top of the range sports car, you can have an electric Porsche, or you can drive an electric scooter, but they're all fueled by electrical energy generated potentially by renewable resources. And here in the UK, where we're often on over 50% renewables, your electric vehicle, whether it's a car or a truck or a bus, is contributing to reducing our carbon footprint. The thing about reducing our carbon footprints is that we cannot do it alone. We may want to pursue active travel, but if bike lane comes to an end, then it's much harder for us to do that. So we need local authorities and we need government to really put that infrastructure in place, so that we have not just the bike lanes that we need to be able to ride around securely, but even just the walking routes. The picture in the middle is what happens if you follow a Google map from Birmingham International Airport to the National Transport Museum, rather ironically. Halfway through the route, you come to this dead end. That's no good. We need walking routes which actually pair up where people are departing from to where they would like to go to. And we need to really design that in throughout our system. The picture on the right is a housing estate built in my local area in Calderdale, West Yorkshire. Great housing estate within a mile of local amenities and the school. However, if you were a parent thinking your kids should be walking to school, would you really want to send them along a road which didn't even have a pavement? So we really need to look at our infrastructure and ensure that we have put in place the routes and the safe infrastructure for people to make active travel choices. So here, just to inspire us, we've got a few examples of some Dutch cycle lanes, and a reminder that really, if we want to use bikes more, we need to provide for them. We need to put in parking for bikes as much as we do for cars, more than we do for cars, to really encourage people to think it's an easy and viable thing for them to do. We need to encourage people to take the train with their bike so that they make that multimodal journey as safely and comfortably as possible. One of the things that I think is really, really important to highlight is this is not about making us do less overall. It's about changing the way that we do things and growing a sustainable economy. On the left, there's a picture of me cycling through the Isle of Man with a group that I cycle with regularly who have adapted bicycles, so their bikes don't necessarily fit down really skinny infrastructure. And we're on a road there. And we do this, we do take holidays, spend lots of money in local economies. But we can only really do that if the infrastructure is there to make us feel secure in doing it. And one of the things I want to highlight is that if you put in this infrastructure, it will grow the sustainable tourism economy and grow the sustainable delivery economy as well. Picture on the right is a cycle road in Germany. The road for cars is on the left, but the cycle road is in the middle. And that is a safe road that people in all sorts of vehicles, small pedalled vehicles and on foot can go down. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the use of those roads, the cycle tourism industry in Germany employs 200,000 people. That's not just the cycling industry. That is this mere subsection of the cycle industry that is to provide for people who are riding their bikes for leisure and tourist purposes. People make 5 million trips of over 3 days on their bikes a year in Germany. So there's a huge market if we can put the infrastructure in there for it. And we also make cities nicer. and we make people want to shop and wander and walk and enjoy. And I think this is a really important thing, that if we can exclude some of the bigger vehicles from our city streets, we actually promote cities, and we promote leisure, and we promote sales. So it's about making our environment nicer, but it's also about ensuring that our economy switches over to something that's much more sustainable and makes people happy. I think this is the really essential thing, that if you walk around Paris, the picture on the left now, in the centre where there are far fewer vehicles and far more bikes and walking, it's a changed city. It's much less stressful, it's much more vibrant. And all of our little vehicles and walking activities make that more vibrant and less stressful. You can see here in Bath, we've got pedestrian areas and they're really busy. Lots of people are buying lots of things in shops, even despite the pandemic and the lockdown that we've been through. So I think there's a huge role for COVID recovery and changing the economy so that it's sustainable and green, and that we can all work together to be able to achieve this. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope there are a few ideas for you to help both campaign for and cut your own carbon footprint. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, BRT. That was really interesting. And as a fellow cyclist, not a road biker, but I am a road cyclist, not a mountain biker. But I did appreciate what you said about cycling. This year I've done nearly 3,000 miles just around St Mary's. We've only got 9 miles of road. Get quite dizzy at times. So anyway, thank you very much for that. And the next section of this session, rather, get it right, is on transport, is a local advocate, Dr. Tim Fox, and he has represented, or will be representing Benevent, a Cornish company unlocking the power of biomethane. And this sounds really interesting. In order to deliver a local clean energy revolution. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you, Beate, for that really interesting introduction and presentation. There's so much in there that we need to pick up on in the next 15 minutes, and I hope that we can cover it all. I just want to first off say that obviously the areas that you touched on were really important, particularly in terms of thinking about a hierarchy for transport, a transport hierarchy where we start off at the top. The most sustainable is trying to reduce demand in the first place, and to make a modal shift through to more active forms of participation as individuals. So, the comments you were making around cycling and walking, I mean, here in the UK, something like 26% of the population already uses walking as a mode of transport for very short journeys, for short trips. And, that seems like an area that would be very fruitful to build on in terms of our local activities, particularly in rural locations. I'm speaking to you here from Cornwall, and it's a very rural economy. And of course, we're all very interested in how what you're talking about could be implemented in a rural setting, in a very rural setting with very small towns. And that infrastructure point was really important, I think, about very simple infrastructure, lots of, lack of pavements, lack of walking routes that come to a dead end, and those kind of things. So I just want to unpack that a little bit with you to see what it is that a rural location like Cornwall could do to try and build on that, what looks like a relatively straightforward win with 26% of the population already walking. It clearly wouldn't be too hard to encourage us to walk a little bit more. What's the nub of the barrier to moving forward with putting in place that very simple infrastructure?
Oh, it's really hard to say. There's no magic single bullet. I think there's a lot of different elements. One is reassessing what paths people have got. I mean, and what routes the council have to put new paths in, because sometimes there are footpaths across fields and things, and you might not want to use those to walk to work, for instance, because you need to turn up at the work looking a certain, reasonably, not too mud splattered. And the same with cycling. So, on the one hand, we don't want to sort of like concrete over the countryside, but on the other, we do want to make paths that are usable for walking to work, two cycles to ride next to each other, people on adapted bikes. So I think it's balancing off that kind of what paths are we creating? Can we make some of our existing walking routes more accessible? Because the style is really not great if you're trying to get your wheelchair over it. So, can we do some of that? Leave some of the wilder stuff for sure, but make sure some of the easier footpaths are wider and more accessible.
Is there an issue of funding in there, do you think? Is there
there's a couple of things? Because there's actually, this is very nerdy, but there's the whole sort of public rights of way issues and being able to upgrade a right of way from a footpath to a bridle way, for instance, could be a legal obstacle. So it's not just the funding, it's also the legal frameworks for footpath rights of way and footways and roads. And if you build this, it has to reach this standard and stuff like that. So there's more than just funding. There's farmers saying, yeah, okay, you can have a 1.5 metre strip of my field. The path that I was showing in Germany, the bike road, that had to be negotiated in some way to get the route to mirror, to give you an off-road pedestrian and cycle route that is next to the road, not squeezed into the edge of it. So so funding is one thing, legislation or people agreeing, people not going, okay, we're going to work together, and not saying no, you're not having a bit of my land is the other thing.
So a lot of scope maybe for community groups to pick up on that in their local community and try to sort of broker those conversations, to convene those sort of conversations.
Yeah, and the community benefit is quite big. The cycle market could be enormous. It's a great, you've got a lovely mild climate compared to West Yorkshire. And instead of people towing massive caravans around the lanes, you could have cyclists instead. And then, you're on to kind of reducing traffic as well as switching to a sustainable economy.
Yeah, and traffic reduction in a place like Cornwall is quite challenging, because clearly we have our local traffic throughout the year, but we also have huge influx of vehicles from outside the county during the holiday season, which of course as the climate is changing is sort of extending, and during the post-pandemic era has been very lengthy because people are trying to take breaks. So I just wanted to explore a little bit that sort of idea around how we as a county like Cornwall can sort of accommodate that, what is a large part of our sort of economic sector, the tourist industry, alongside our local activities. So, how do you see us sort of putting in place the necessary policies and actions to accommodate both of those? So encouraging people to be more active locally in terms of the mode of transport they select, but of course then having to allow for infrastructure to cope with the influx of tourists, which are vital to our economy down here.
I think there is a role for trying to persuade tourists to access all tourist locations more sustainably, using the train and then having transport systems that will enable them to make their onward journeys. I know that the Lake District National Park has a similar problem, that most of the carbon emissions connected with transport in the Lake District are people getting there. That's very much because they are arriving in cars. So there are lots of different things they've done to try and persuade people to leave their cars at home, whether it's providing hire bikes, get here by car, but then you can hire a nice electric bike and potter around. And this is the kind of tourism that actually is really beneficial in two ways, because if you're on a bike, you're not cluttering up the road with your sort of 4x4, but you're also more likely to spend money in cafes and shops because you're passing them by. You can just get off the bike, might be hungry because you've been cycling and things like that. So I think there's a huge role for electric bike hire businesses, and encouraging people to come to arrive by sustainable means and then use bikes for their onward travel. Even little Twizzies and car club cars. I don't know if you've seen the tiny little electric vehicles. I think they've got a fleet of those in the Lake District for people to arrive and then borrow those. And again, much narrower, because I don't know if it's in Cornwall. My memories are that it's quite similar to Yorkshire, where you have narrow lanes, and you don't really want to encourage people to come in very large vehicles.
Yeah. No, that's very, very, very interesting. And I of course, in the 1950s and 60s, we used to get huge sort of, trains of very great length coming down here, bringing people into the county. But of course, all that got replaced when the car became king. But I mean, to some extent, the car is going to continue to be king for some people for quite a long time to come. And of course, there's a lot of work going on in shifting to electric vehicles. But then in a place like Cornwall, we have some real infrastructure issues around the ability to provide the power for the recharging infrastructure that enables us to service that load, particularly in the holiday season. Of course, that's one of the areas that Benneman's very involved in. If you saw the film in the energy section earlier today, John Carley from the Chasewater Community Centre group was talking about our electric vehicle charging project, which uses biomethane from livestock slurry to power a mobile off-grid electric vehicle charger, which could be set up in a village car park or a sort of fairly remote rural location during the holiday season to enable people to recharge their cars, and then could be moved on to primary routes coming into the county during the holiday season to service that and encourage the use of electric vehicles within the county. And then, at various seasonal and out of season times of year, could be used to support arts festivals, music festivals, and indeed, to be semi-permanent in some locations where the local demand is high enough. So I think there is an issue there around getting that balance right between, us wanting to follow the transport hierarchy and bring people closer to the more active end of that, but also for organisations like ourselves to help support people that are either reluctant or they continue to want to use electric vehicles, or indeed public transport like buses, etc. I was very interested, though, on that, to what you were saying around van deliveries. So, of course, there has been an explosion in home delivery, both in terms of online shopping for consumer goods, but also online shopping for food, etc., particularly exacerbated during the pandemic or encouraged during the pandemic. And indeed, those emissions increases are well known to be associated largely in the transport sector with the growth of the small van market. So again, looking at your sort of cycle vehicles, I was very interested in what you said around the fact that most of these vans are half empty. I mean, are there hard sort of facts and data around that?
I think only by organisations that have enough money to do this sort of research. I think, in central London, Transport for London, it's been one of their headaches. So they've done quite a lot of work on van delivery being quite a big issue, and it's them that see the half empty vans, and that's a concern for them. So I don't know research for Cornwall. I do know that the last mile is the most expensive mile for any delivery company, and so there's a lot of scope for us to look at how we create little micro consolidation hubs, maybe, so that you're not having several different half-empty vans for different companies wandering around the lanes, coming up against each other, and then having to reverse half a mile to be able to pass each other, and which is inefficient from both their point of view and the climate's point of view. So there's a lot of scope. It's stuff that we haven't done yet. There's there are lots of things that are being done in city centres around cargo bike delivery, which it looks great and that's good. But we tend to forget about the rural areas, which is actually really, it's not a good thing to forget about the rural areas, because the carbon footprint for rural areas tends to be higher per capita than it does in city centres. So we really need to be looking at how we do things more sustainably. And in rural areas, we're often quite good at maximising resource utilisation, because communities tend to be a bit smaller. And so car clubs in rural areas, although they don't have this huge group of people to draw on, they might have people who are willing to kind of negotiate, well, it needs to be used for this between 9 and 10 and this later in the afternoon, and between us we can build up something that makes something highly utilisable. And I think that similar kind of attitude could well be good and work well in a rural area for delivery consolidation and micro delivery hubs. So that's
I'm really interested in what you're saying there, because if I think about Cornwall and, our towns are relatively small. We've got a large number of villages and hamlets, and then, very remote houses, often several miles between a house. And I think the idea of sort of consolidation centres, which pick up smaller electric vehicles that are much more heavily utilised in terms of what they take on each journey, I think would be really interesting. And of course, but we have to get some, the goods and food has to get to those consolidation centres. So I'm interested to take the conversation into the area of heavy goods vehicles. And I mean, as you probably know, 12% of the UK's transport emissions come from heavy goods vehicles, which are very challenging in terms of electrification. I wonder whether you've done any work or you have any thoughts on how we handle those long distance freight journeys before we get to consolidation centres. I mean, the government's very keen to phase out non-zero emissions vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, and I'm just wondering where your thoughts are on that.
I think we've missed a trick a bit by moving away from rail freight, and both from the HGV driver crisis point of view and the carbon point of view. It was quite noticeable that Tesco managed to big up its green and supply chain credentials by demonstrating how rail freight had helped it keep operating throughout all of the different crises we've been through recently. So rail freight could definitely be taking more of the weight here and taking some of the lorries off the roads, which will benefit everyone. So that, and we've seen some business models where there's potential for rail freight to then sort of also be used on a smaller level, parcels as passengers. So some of the local lines also may be bearing smaller containers rather than big containers to try and get down to community level without using our road infrastructure quite so intensively. Then there's no single solution that's really been set upon in haulage, in road haulage. There's a lot of talk of hydrogen, there's talk of electrification. Obviously there are electric trucks out there that are in development. We have electric buses, but they're not doing the sort of same kind of like road miles. But we do have some of the technology in development. We've also got some ideas about pantographs, so which would then change our motorways quite considerably if you had one rail that was like essentially a lorry tram. So I don't know if you've ever driven on roads.
I'm very familiar with the pantograph idea, and it's a favourite of the Climate Change Committee, of course, and it has some merit on very sort of major trunk routes like the M1 and the M5, and maybe coming up from ports like Felixstowe and Dover into sort of consolidation centres around London and Manchester, etc. But I think given how long it's taking to get the Great Western Railway sort of electrified to anything like the west and southwest of Bristol, I think it's been on the agenda for a very long time. There's a huge, from an engineering perspective, a huge project to undertake that. So doing the roads as well is a massive project. But I think outside that, I mean, at the moment, the area that Benjamin works in sort of biomethane production, I mean, biomethane is one of the key low carbon fuels being used at the moment to build low carbon fleets for major hauliers, and there's certainly a long-term place for that within the mix. And what Benjamin is trying to do is to provide that biomethane at a local level, again from farm manures, farm waste, and containing everything in that local environment to offer refueling in that local environment, and enabling farmers to play a part in that energy market.
I think one of the things you're highlighting there is actually that we're probably going back to a fuel diversity situation with road transport that we haven't had for about 100 years. I mean, when road vehicles were invented back in the 19th century, we had petrochemical fueled cars, electric cars, yes, and steam-powered vehicles, and on the roads. And it was only, I think, really with sort of Model T and kind of like being able to mass-produce vehicles, and obviously the Model T was petrol, so that's the way we went, and we became this entirely petrol-run economy. When actually we could have been quite different. You know, there wasn't a real technological advantage. It was a production advantage at that point. So. Heterogeneous fuel sources, and I think it's probably important to be less individually dependent on any one than it was. I mean, we don't want to get to a situation where we're deliberately creating biomethane to fuel vehicles. We want to be able to know that we can do, this will deal with this in this situation, but we don't want that to be the only fuel out there. Yeah. Likewise, electric. We have to make sure the grid can cope with it. You know, it's being resilient means actually having more different ways of doing things available to us. I wouldn't say choice exactly, because it's more kind of, sometimes it's determined by where you are and what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you on that. And it builds energy security, it builds resilient communities, and ultimately it will also help us adapt to climate change, because those communities are more resilient with their local fuel supplies, and broader energy supplies around power and heat. I just want to touch on, because I'm conscious of time, that one of the areas that we haven't really spoken about is aviation, and of course we do have an airport in Cornwall, and we do have a proportion of people that come to Cornwall by plane, and a proportion of Cornish people and people that live in Cornwall that go out of Cornwall by plane. So I'm just interested in your take on sort of decarbonising aviation, whether you have any thoughts.
Make them go on the train. I'm sorry. I mean, at the moment the technology isn't there to do more than short haul flights by electric plane. We're seeing a couple of pilots up in Scotland, short haul island hopping planes, and I really think that we need to really focus on making the train a rapid it needs to have the equivalence, and if you're traveling within the country, you need to be traveling on the train. I went from Paris to Montpellier in 3 hours, at 200 miles an hour. I don't see why we can't do that in this country. We should be, we really do need to be looking at our our land-based transport to make sure that it isn't desperately inferior to flying. Yes. I mean, we also need to develop sustainable fuels, but I think, it's just such a big proportion of emissions are aviation. When you consider that our UK emission total for aviation is 33 megatons of carbon equivalent, and our entire transport emissions are 122. I mean, that's that's about 20% on top again from a very, very small number of people relative to the population of the country who are flying. When that 120 odd million tons is providing us with food, getting everyone to work, and all of those things. Flying is a real luxury, and you shouldn't do it too often. And so I'm sorry to be a bit of a part.
No, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. And of course, I mean, the Climate Change Committee and the government are looking at the moment with a biomass strategy where biomass should be used most effectively, within the UK. And part of that mix is potentially some use of biofuels in aviation, sustainable aviation fuels. So there is some scope there, but I certainly very interested in what you were saying about modal shift, and certainly there's a huge amount of work to suggest that relatively short journeys. I can't recall the exact figure, but of a small number of hours are much better achieved by train. I'm not sure how much longer we have, Steve, for the conversation, or are we moving into Q&A now?
I was just about to interrupt. A really interesting conversation, but we've got less than 10 minutes now before we start the next session, and I've got some questions coming in. So I'd rather like to move to the questions. The first one's quite interesting, actually. How can you improve the infrastructure for electric cars? I live in a rural area, and many of us don't have driveways in our village to charge our cars. Now, that is interesting to me because on St Mary's and on the Isles of Scilly, we've actually recently installed 33 electric vehicle charging points. I think 19 or 20 of them are on St Mary's alone. And St Mary's is only 3 miles across with 9 miles of road. So we're a bit ahead of the game there. So I'll be interested to find out what you say about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to go first, or shall I go?
Okay, I'm going to start at the bottom, having looked at the question that's come through about car clubs for electric cars. One of the best ways of being able to access electric cars is by having a car club. And as I was talking about it earlier, rural communities are really good at organising these sorts of things. And for Jill Scott Anderson, go to COMO.uk. .org.uk. It's the umbrella group for car clubs in the UK, and they have lots of advice about setting up rural car clubs, because that way you can share electric cars, and the technology is available to make those doable in rural context. It's a really interesting scheme.
And this issue of sort of electric vehicle charging of personal vehicles is really quite challenging, because if you've got a rural home that has some drive, or you have some way then of participating in the electric vehicle world. And indeed that's one application of the sort of mobile EV off-grid EV charger that we're producing, is that it produces some heat as well. So the idea is to heat the building as well as charge the car, and we'll actually be doing a demonstration of that next year. But I think this challenge that we have both in very sort of dense urban areas in the UK, but also in rural villages in places like Cornwall, is that a huge amount of the terraced housing is has absolutely no off-road access at all, and that is a real challenge. And car clubs are one component of that potential solution.
Surely, I mean, there's an issue because people are either parking their cars on street, or you have to provide a public car park where the roads are too narrow to park on street. So surely public charging points can be installed in those. And there are different models for car charging. There's rapid charging, which you can charge your car within an hour generally, using really big sort of 150 kilowatt chargers. Or the other option is overnight charging, where it just trickles along. It's better for the grid and it's better for your car battery. But one of the things that councils need to really understand is that to encourage that shift, you need to provide something that's cost effective at both those ends of the spectrum. Most people would be happy to charge slowly for less money, because the cost is higher to install the equipment for rapid charging. So it's kind of fair that it costs more to charge your car at a rapid charging unit. And that's the top up charge, the oh dear, I didn't plug it in overnight charge. Whereas so really every council needs an electric vehicle charging strategy to be that's part of the mix. Bringing in mobile charging units, trying things out is also really important. This is a big change we're all going through. This is not we've not sort of like a minor shift, and actually having a little bit of faith to let people go try things and experiment a bit is a really vital part of the process. So if you can sort of say, right, okay, does this charger here work? Would you like to try an electric vehicle through a car club or something like that? Here are some credits to give it a go. Do that's all.
Yeah, very interesting.
Quite, it's not just a down, you will do this because people want to do the best thing, but it's enabling them to do the best thing. And I think that's, really comes through in the dialogue between people and councils. It's like, we'd like to do it, but we're not quite sure, and we don't think we've necessarily made it as easy as you could have done. I'm just looking through this list of electric car transport. Changing behaviours is very much about providing different tools there. And good. I think it was really interesting during the pandemic, people walked and cycled a lot more because there were fewer cars on the roads. It was a lot safer, so people did it. So I think, changing behaviours, safety is probably, and accessibility of tools, probably the best way of changing behaviour, is saying, look, it is safe, because a lot of people do want to do the right thing. And once you've got that critical mass, every time you've got a cyclist on the road, you're actually making it safer for other cyclists. So once you've got that critical mass of people, it becomes the obvious choice.
It's self-fulfilling, isn't it? It becomes
exactly.
Like a virtuous cycle.
Yes. So changing behaviours, you have to kick it off, and it always takes a few brave people to do that. But it also. What
role do you think there are for sort of community level groups in this? I mean, we've got some really good community groups in Cornwall that are focused on sort of energy. I mean, do you see there's a role for the council? And there's a role for the individual. Yeah. But somewhere in there, we need a way of convening people within a community to take this one of the experimentation forward.
There are community groups that are about energy, and then there are community groups about social stuff. Can you get your people who are doing stuff about social stuff to use cargo bikes? During the pandemic, we were doing a lot of food bank deliveries to support the food bank in Todmorden, and we were using cargo bikes. Now, I personally regard driving as a waste of my life, whereas I'm quite happy I'm quite happy to take food parcels in a cargo bike. So you can engage different people in voluntary work by providing a different set of tools. So it's not just the energy people banging on about energy and the food people banging on about food. It's like, can you use some of the low energy ways of doing your social good work to change the whole of that kind of economy. It's more than it's that multi approach that I think is.
Thank you very much, Beate. Actually, a pair of you have answered several questions in one go. So, and in fact, the next one I'm going to make point out is Cornish villages have few buses, are infrequent and take ages. We can't afford electric cars. Few pavements here. Train stations are miles away. What solutions are there accessible to all? And I think you hinted at community user group in one of those answers just now.
I think Beate is probably best placed to answer that.
Okay. Buses, my other favourite subject besides cargo bikes. So I think one of the issues is that we've got the potential with the Bus Back Better, the government's national bus strategy, to really look at this problem of rural bus, because it's not fair to demand that everyone has their own car. What if you can't drive? What if you have a medical condition? What if you're becoming too old and your eyesight's not safe to drive? We really do need transport. I mean, in France, they've actually got a law that says everyone should have access to transport. And the way that they are dealing with this is through having small community accessible buses, which could be electric. This is that actually come to people on demand. So there's a whole role for community transport to help the electrification and demand responsive bus transport, which people need to kind of ask for it to a certain extent, because I think that we've had deregulated buses for the last 40 odd years. We've not really been able to map buses and say, where would you like to go? What kind of buses would you like? But the fact that people want them means that bus companies and the local councils from this year forward have to work together on a plan to get buses out to the people that really want them. So a bit of a rambling answer, but we've got tools for change in our hands at the moment. It's called your bus improvement plan, and it should have been published by the 30th of October, and your bus companies and your local council will be making an enhanced partnership, and if it's not what you want, go and tell them.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both very much. I'm afraid we've just slightly overrun our time, so we'll have to leave it there. But it's been a really, really interesting conversation. And don't forget that our speakers cannot answer or cover everything in the allotted time, which we've proved because we could go on all afternoon. And we hope really that it would stimulate thinking about climate change and what we can do about it. And one interesting point that did come up from the presentation was that we cannot do it alone. And that's the whole point of that Let's Talk action plan. So thank you very much, both of you, for coming online today, and we'll have to leave it there. So goodbye.
Thank you very much. And
thank you. Bye, everyone.
thank you.